We're ready to get started. So our next speaker is Matthias Haase. His paper is titled True Life. Haase he's an assistant professor in the philosophy department at the University of Chicago. And before this, he was a professor at the University of Leipzig. His research is focused on foundational topics of the intersection of ethics and philosophy of mind. A central historical interest is the tradition of German idealism, especially the aspects that are tied to Aristotle. He has also written on Wittgenstein and Frege. He has several recent papers that are related to our topic, or papers stretching back. So, a recent paper published this year, Anscombe on the Dignity of the Human Being. Another paper published in 2020, Life and Recognition, Michael Thompson's Practical Naturalism. A paper on Philippa Foot, Practically Self-Conscious Life, published in 2018. Which, in my opinion, is somewhat similar to MacIntyre's own kind of thoughts on Foot's naturalism. Also, an earlier paper published in 2013 on Hegel, titled "Life and Mind." So let's welcome Matthias, and also please note that there's a handout in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and for all the wonderful talks we had so far. I'm not sure I can keep it up. I learned a lot so far. And right, there is a handout. Don't be worried. I won't read it all. Otherwise, we will be here tomorrow. I just have a collection of quotations. A quick question. What's our plan? How long do I have to talk? We're running like hours late, right?
We're a little over. So, I mean, around 45 minutes, right? Is that?
Okay, sure. All right, good. All right, great. So I have to confess, I'm much less knowledgeable about MacIntyre's work than all of the other speakers we heard. I'm confused about an aspect of MacIntyre that has to do with his shift from after virtue, which officially is closest to what seems like the historicism of Hegel, as he calls it, and what he calls his Thomistic turn in inter alia dependent rational animals. So my plan in what follows is to raise a pedestrian question, which might just articulate a confusion on my part, or it might help to see that Hegel, and in a way Marx following him, tried to fill what appears to be, anachronistically put, a lacuna in MacIntyre's way of setting it up. I hope that my internet is stable. I had some difficulties in the last hour, but let's see how it works. All right. It may be fitting to, since in different ways MacIntyre and Hegel are both Christian philosophers, here's a way to raise a question that I'm interested in, according to a familiar story about the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. Eating from the one excluded eating from the other. Against this background, it's obviously very significant for the Christian theological tradition that there's someone who's in the position to say, I am the truth and the life, such that the knowledge and the life is one. Of course, this may be put primarily as a theological issue, but there is a similar question within practical philosophy that's connected to how Aristotle conceives of knowledge of the good. We might ask the following question, whether for us, truth can only ever reside in truth about the living, true judgments about what is good for us to do, or whether it can reside in the living itself, such that we can be said to do the truth or to live truly. Now, the latter way of speaking is, of course, confusing for analytic tradition that focuses on the idea that what is true or false are propositions, judgments, and not actions. And one might wonder why one would want to speak that way. Now, in Aristotle, there's arguably a clear reason why one might want to speak of doing the truth, because he holds that when it comes to the question how to live, one grasps the truth only by acting and living well. That is to say, on Aristotle's view of phronesis, the only way to know the good is to do the good. And as he further specifies, do the good in the community with others. That's the character of what he calls practical wisdom, the only way of genuinely knowing the good. The kind of knowledge, as he says, that one only has insofar as one does act well. And he also says that it can't be had by an individual in isolation, but that the primary form of practical wisdom is manifested in running a household and in governing the polis. Now it's clear that MacIntyre, in arguing for a neo-Aristotelian revival of virtue, has something like that in mind. The question how to live, as he puts it, is answered by living. So the questions Aristotle articulates about what is my good, qua member of a household, qua citizen, and so on, is one that everyone, he says, answers by the way in which they act and live. Now, this way of framing the issue allows one to distinguish what I think is a fundamental divide within the history of ethics between what I call actualism and possibilism about the good. The view just articulated contrasts, for instance, with the position that Kant endorses. Kant holds what I would call possibilism. We know our capacity to act freely or autonomously through knowing the law that prescribes how we ought to act. Kant will say such knowledge is practical in that it is efficacious and will bring about good action if nothing interferes, but he will also say that the human condition is such that inevitably something interferes, such that we can never know the actuality of the good. In consequence, the good presents itself as a mere ideal towards which we can only infinitely strive. Now, this goes together, or is fundamentally in the Kantian system, goes together with the gulf between two kinds of judgments, practical judgments and practical knowledge, which is about what ought to be, not about what is, and judgments about what is that are theoretical and not practical. Now, in a way that is, as several people have pointed out, precisely the gulf between ought and is, that MacIntyre rejects an after virtue. And of course, that he shares with Hegel. It's precisely that feature of Kant that attracts Hegel's scorn. But now Hegel thinks that in order to articulate the alternative, what I call actualism, the Aristotelian actualism, requires a radically distinct account of truth, as well as the relation between the theoretical and the practical, which, according to Hegel, requires what he calls speculative logic. Now, to bring this to properly articulate what Hegel does there would require too much time. I just want to highlight a couple of points to have in mind. One thing is that Hegel rejects what Kant and others treat as the primary notion of truth, namely the truth of judgment, as merely formal truth, merely esoteric truth, as he calls it, or mere correctness. So he says, by truth, one understands at first that I know how something is, but this truth is only in truth in relation to consciousness, merely formal truth, whereas the deeper sense of truth, Hegel argued, consists in objectivity being identical with the concept. And the example he gives is a true state. I mean, the true state in the sense of der Staat, or a true work of art. These objects are true when they are as they should be, that is, when they correspond to their concept. Now, in the further development of this notion of what is sometimes called the metaphysical notion of truth, he introduces what he calls the idea, and the further development of that, he introduces what he calls the absolute idea, which he defines as the unity of the theoretical and the practical idea. That is, the unity of what is and what ought to be. So the truth of the good, he says there, is posited as the unity of the theoretical and the practical idea. That is, a purpose that is realized and through its activity persists in realizing itself. Or as he puts it later on, the idea of freedom is not an idea we have about ourselves, but it's the idea that we are. In fact, MacIntyre quotes that passage in his short history of ethics. Now it's important to notice that this notion of the absolute that he introduces in the logic has nothing to do, at least not in the first place, with the idea of an end of history, as MacIntyre sometimes calls it. But it's the very thing that Hegel thinks is required to reject that gulf between the cognition of what is and the cognition of what ought to be. That is, the crucial point for the present purpose is that what he calls proper practical or ethical knowledge in what he calls Sittlichkeit or ethical life is supposed to be understood through the unity of the theoretical and the practical. That is, the unity of the theoretical and the practical, knowledge of what is as knowledge of what ought to be, is supposed to characterize the kind of knowledge that one has in virtue of being part of ethical life, or what he calls the objective spirit. So the actual free will is the unity of the theoretical and the practical mind, he says. So the free will knows itself as free and wills itself as free. So unless the good is actual in our way of living, in the realized freedom, our conception of the good would be merely formal, or mere deceit, or mere ideology, as Marx would put it. Now, the crucial point is that the further development of this idea for Hegel is that is the idea of the realization of freedom in modern ethical life. And the extreme ambition of the thought that he tries to articulate is that, properly understood, freedom cannot be realized just by one or just by some. Rather, freedom has to be realized by all, at least within the community of ethical life, if anyone is to be free. So to know myself as free, I have to recognize you as free, and not just in letting you do your thing, but in the way we live together in a society of ethical life, such that we can say, we are the truth and the life. So in this sense, the realization of the good in his conception of the state is supposed to be indeed, as Dean Moya pointed out, the realization of the absolute, not that it can't develop any further. In fact, he himself points to all kinds of contradictions within the Sittlichkeit he's articulating, but namely, for instance, the contradiction having to do with the market and the rabble and poverty. But the crucial point is that his definition of Sittlichkeit as the unity of abstract right and morality is to be the substantive conception of the good, where freedom has to be for all if it's to be for anyone. Now, my question's going to be, in what way does MacIntyre's work stand to that Hegelian project? Now, we can see there are two strands, well, there are probably more, but two strands that I want to focus on in MacIntyre's work. On the one hand, there is what one might call socio-historical actualism of after virtue. There he explicitly says that the only way to know the good is through the participation in the concrete social practices belonging to a concrete historical tradition that realizes or embodies a conception of the good. So he says, if the conception of the good has to be explained in terms of such notions as those of practice, or of the narrative unity of human life and of a moral tradition, then good, and with them the only grounds for authority, laws, and of virtues, can only be discovered by entering into those relationships, which constitute communities' central. Right. So the only way to know what ought to be is by actually participating in concrete practices. So there is no way of knowing the good as an ideal. You only know, if there is knowledge of the good, then only insofar as you're partaking in the actuality of those practices and traditions. Now, the second strand, on the face of it, looks a little different. While after virtue rejects any idea of grounding ethics and, sorry, I'm confused about my handout here. So while after virtue rejects any idea of grounding ethics and neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics within what he calls Aristotle's metaphysical biology, MacIntyre later states himself the need for something like a metaphysical grounding. And he, in fact, in his own Thomistic Aristotelianism, does appeal to biology. According to that conception, it is only because one can derive a final end from our nature as the kind of animals we are, that one can speak of practices as embodying or realizing goods. So he puts it, for instance, in the prologue in the third edition of After Virtue. He says, in After Virtue, I had tried to present the case for a broadly Aristotelian account of the virtues without making use of or appeal to what I called Aristotle's metaphysical biology. But I now learn from Aquinas that my attempt to provide an account of the human good purely in social terms, in terms of practice of traditions and the narrative unity of lives, was bound to be inadequate until I had provided with a metaphysical grounding. It is only because human beings have an end towards which they are directed by reason of their specific natures that practices, traditions, and the like are to be able to function as they do. And now it looks like that argument, and in fact, the way the book proceeds, namely dependent rational animals, we don't quite, to articulate that final end, we don't need to go into the concrete history of ethics. It gets more complicated in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity because the two strands are now brought together. He now suggests at the end of that book that we need a narrative justification of the Thomistic grounding of the idea of a final end, when he suggests at the end that all the arguments for the goodness of particular actions and practices that he articulates within the book are, as he would put it, from within a schomistic scheme of thought. But when that scheme itself is put into question, the arguments of the Thomist will have to be of a different kind. Then they need to provide a historical narrative. And there he himself says he thinks he's moving beyond, and as some Thomists would say, away from Aquinas, insisting on this narrative structure that even seems to underwrite what independent rational animals were presented as the grounding metaphysical claim. On the other hand, he then returns to Aquinas at the very end of the book by the idea, which has something of what Robert Stern was pointing on towards in his talk, that he gets from Aquinas the idea of the final good being something that presents itself in our life as the indeterminate, as something that we have to remain open towards and cannot identify with any determinate end. So he says it may seem paradoxical, but it is not. to express that insight by saying that on his view, Aquinas' view, we complete and perfect our lives by allowing them to remain incomplete and thus open to the good that isn't yet realized. Now, the question I want to focus on is not the last point, but the relation between the view of after virtue, which focuses on narrative, and the view of the idea of foundation in atomistic Aristotelianism that focuses on the biology of the kind of animals we are. Now, it looks like in both cases, there's something common to his procedure that I call MacIntyre's university thesis. And the university thesis with respect to virtue, practice, and tradition in after virtue has to do with the following aspects. So in his preliminary definition of virtue, we have heard this already before, a virtue is an acquired human quality, the possession and exercise of which tends to enable us to achieve those goods which are internal to practices, and the lack of which effectively prevents us from achieving any such goods. Now, the example for practices there is, for instance, chess or architecture. But if chess is a practice with internal goods, so will be barter or buying and selling. They also have internal goods, just internal to the practices. Now, by the same token, he argues that this preliminary definition of virtue by appeal to the goods internal to practices cannot be sufficient, because strangely, the way he defines practices and their internal goods are such that what is the internal good of a practice may in fact be bad. So as he points out, is on his account, there may be practices which are simply evil. So of course, the appeal to practices on his definition of what a practice is cannot in any way be sufficient to define virtue. For that reason, he needs the two further steps, namely the idea that virtues are to be situated in the narrative embodying a whole life of an individual, and furthermore in the narrative unity of a historical tradition. So a virtue, according to this third aspect, is that which sustains and strengthens traditions. But now one can wonder whether the appeal to these two kinds of bigger unities articulated in a narrative can actually solve the problem raised by the idea that a practice, as he defines it, may be something that is in fact bad. Because just as he has a univocal notion of a practice, such that a practice can be something good or bad, he has an equally univocal notion of a narrative unity of an individual life, and a univocal notion of a tradition such that there can be good and bad traditions. For the same reason, we can ask whether we actually can understand by the framework of after virtue a claim that, according to after virtue, belongs to the definition of what virtue is, namely that it furnishes us with increasing self-knowledge and increasing knowledge of the good, as he puts it. For we may ask, how can we actually speak of knowledge here? After all, there doesn't seem to be a standard for a proper way of sustaining a tradition. Now, and so this of course has been discussed as the problem of relativism he runs into. And it's interesting in the postscript to postscript. I misspelled it on my handout. The postscript to the second edition, he discusses the charge of relativism, and he argues, as Rahel has pointed out, that in many cases, one tradition can be proven to be rationally superior to another by way of some internal criticism, but this requires that there is a certain overlap between the two traditions, that they're engaging with similar problems. But this may also not be the case. So he says it cannot, on his own account, be ruled out that there may be a confrontation between two traditions where it is not there's no rational way to settle the disagreement between true rival and moral epistemological traditions. So there are positive grounds for the relativistic thesis would emerge. And then he says, I have no interest in denying this. It's essential to the position of after virtue that this idea of relativism remains open. And he says there in the same passage that anything else would mean to return to something like the Kantian project to establish a priori truths that are independent of what actually goes on in history. Now I point this out because Hegel would insist that of course there is a third alternative. He will deny that we can establish it a priori without articulating the development of spirit in history, but he would insist that at any point in history, they're not rival opposing traditions such that it's open. Which one is the better one? The whole point of his project is to give a dialectical articulation such that at each point one can say that the one he's interested in is the best one one has at the moment. Now it looks to me, but I may be happy to be corrected, that MacIntyre himself thinks something along these lines when he thinks there needs to be a metaphysical foundation, because the way Dependent Rational Animals is written is precisely focused on the idea of trying to ensure the objectivity of ethical judgment. The way this proceeds goes through what I call, or he calls, the university of the central use of good. That is, the focal or central use of good, according to his account, is the one deployed in judgments about the accordance of living individuals with their life form or nature. And he insists that there is no logical difference between judgments about the goodness throughout the realm of living. It's just the difference in the content. So the character, the meaning of good, he says, is the same whether we're speaking of humans, dolphins, or gorillas, or for that matter, about plants. And he insists it's exactly the same with flourishing and need. These are all not analogical concepts such that there is a special sense of need or a special sense of good when we talk about the human. It's rather univocal predication, he says. It's just that what is characteristic of us such that it will amount to flourishing when exercising those capacities is different, but what it means to flourish is the same. Now, and it's precisely this university of good, flourish, and need that's meant to secure the objectivity of judgments about what is good to do. The latter are supposed to be true and false in exactly the same sense as judgments about plants and subrational animals. And it's precisely the independence from my interests and desires or the life I'm engaged in that's supposed to secure the objectivity of the judgment. So he says, its truth or falsity is determined by appeal to standards that are independent of the observer. So of course, when we make judgments about what's good for wolves, it's independent of our desire. And it's supposed to be the same when we make these judgments about what's true about human beings. So in this way, he's establishing what I think is a robust realist view. So the truth about the good, the human good, is supposed to be out there to be grasped, whatever may be thought in a specific tradition at any point in history. So he says, if then the Aristotelians are right, there's truth waiting to be discovered. It's out there. And this goes together. So how am I doing with time? Oh, I have to hurry up. this goes together with his idea of needing two standpoints playing a role in ethical discourse: the standpoint of an external observer and the standpoint of the agent. So the objectivity of this judgment about the good has to do with the possibility of taking an observer standpoint on the human life form, just as one might on plants and suprarational animals. So he says, as with non-human animals, so it is too with human agents. We observe the ends to which characteristically and generally the activities are directed. And then I come back to what fills the gap. And then crucially, it's that we notice that we are they who we are reflecting on. And so what applies to what I, by observation, notice is true of human beings will also have to apply to me. But notice he needs that idea of the observer's point of view towards the human life form to establish the objectivity of judgments about the good as he conceives it. So now these are, on the face of it, two quite different approaches to the issue in After Virtue and Dependent Irrational Animals. Now, what is the same, however, in both of these works is that the central thesis he wants to get from a return to Aristotelian theological account of virtue is that this is supposed to enable us to properly understand the relation between the individual good, or the good of the individual, and the shared or common good, which of course he thinks got lost in modernity, the very idea of the common good. So in After Virtue, he writes, "For what education in the virtues teaches me is that my good as a man is one and the same as the good of those others with whom I'm bound up in human community." So it's the very idea of virtue, or the teleological account of virtue, that is supposed to establish this internal relation between what's good for me and what is good for the human community, such that there is no way of pursuing my good, which is necessarily antagonistic to you pursuing your good, because the good is neither mine nor yours, so it's essentially shared. Similarly, in Dependent Rational Animals, he insists that the individual and the good are internally related, such that it's certainly wrong to think one can explain the common good as the mere sum of individual goods, or derive the common good from a prior notion of individual good. But he also insists that the reverse will also be false. There is, neither can we explain the individual good from an independent notion of the common good. It's rather the good of each particular individual is more than the common good. So now note the crucial aspect that this is supposed to be hold for each human individual. No one is to be simply subordinated to the good of the community. Rather, every particular individual is supposed to have infinite value. That's crucial to the idea of this internal relation of the individual good and the common good. Now he's well aware, of course, that this is supposed to be, that this is in fact a controversial thesis that conflicts with many claims in the history of ethics and with many actual practices that have been there in human history. One focus in After Virtue is the opposition to the individualism of modernity, but it's equally clear that it is as much opposed to what one might call the ancient elitism that can be found in the very tradition of virtue ethics, of which Aristotle is in fact a central proponent, namely of that elitism. Because as MacIntyre points out, according to Aristotle, some individuals are to be subordinated to the good of the community. There are famously the natural slaves, according to Aristotle, whose good is to be servants for those who properly engage in the good. But as MacIntyre points out, the same holds, not the same, but something similar holds for women and the craftsmen and workers who are not partaking, who are excluded from properly partaking in governing the polis, and by definition, therefore, cannot have phronesis. Now the question is, what justifies this, as it were, revolutionary thesis of the internal relation between the individual good and the good of the community, such that each individual has that crucial standing? Now the whole story of After Virtue is, of course, articulated in the idea that the narrative of the unity of the individual life is such that its good is brought to bear in one's understanding of the tradition. But in fact, it's not obvious that the concepts offered in After Virtue can actually justify that internal relation of the good of the individual and the good of the community. For we can ask, why should it be as such incoherent as an individual narrative of a life to conceive of myself as a mere means for the community? Why should it be as such incoherent in terms of the idea of a narrative that some humans, maybe me included, are there to serve? After all, that's precisely Aristotle's narrative, that it's the good of the natural slave to serve. Now it's hard to see, because virtue is ultimately defined in that which sustains the tradition. But in the light of After Virtue, there is no clear proper standard of the right way to sustain a tradition. So why couldn't an unequal society with its equivalent norms could sustain itself through what in that perspective seems like the virtues of following and serving? Now it seems precisely the idea of the possibility of relativism that seems to rule out the acknowledgement of the possibility of relativism seems to imply that there could be a relativism having to do precisely with that issue. Now, if the narrative account of traditions of After Virtue does not provide the resources for this account, for the what one might call the equiprimordial relation between the individual good and the good of the community, then one can ask, what does? There's a passage in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity where it looks like he's thinking the incoherence of Aristotle's account of natural slaves and the other forms of exclusion I mentioned can be derived from the very idea of the teleology of life, where the very idea of life is such that the good of the individual and the good of its species exhibit the internal relation. So the argument is supposed to run as follows. He says the incoherence arises from the tension between these exclusions and Aristotle's account of the human telos and the human ergon, or the human function, namely the idea that what distinguishes human beings is that they're rational agents. And then he says, but if that is the human ergon, then it must be the ergon on every human being. That looks like it follows just from the idea of the ergon of a kind of living thing. But I don't think it belongs, in fact, to Aristotle's account of the characteristic activity of a kind of animal, that it needs to be exhibited in all healthy exemplars of a kind. And in fact, it would be crazy to claim that of all animal kinds. Now, in fact, sorry, so how much time do I've been speaking for a while? No? Oh, right. In fact, it looks like the idea of life is such that indeed it is compatible with it taking a form where the living individual is the mere means for the ends of the reproduction of the species. I give you on the handout this wonderful quote from Stephen Jay Gould about the organic wisdom of a certain kind of fly where the young ones eat the mother from the inside. But of course, the animal kingdom is full of these kinds of reproductive cannibalism. And if anything is ever using someone as a mere means or being a mere means, is being eaten. Now, so at the very least, the idea of animal life doesn't exclude the idea of the individuals being merely subordinated to their kind. In fact, Hegel argues that this is precisely the contradiction in the very idea of life. So he proceeds as follows. He argues that the logical notion of life includes these three processes: the inner process of the organization of the living individual into its parts, the external process of nutrition or assimilation of the external environment. And then he argues, well, these two moments alone don't allow to understand life. We need the Gattungsprozess as well, the process of reproduction, which on his account is the relation of the living being to other living beings. And he argues that this third process in life is the end of each living individual. And it's precisely that priority of the genus process, which from the point of view of the species makes each living being and its maintenance to be a mere means. And so he articulates this as the contradiction of life, in that he says, well, a life form or species or Gattung is a universal that's concrete in that it explains its instances, but it's not instanced or instantiated fully by any of those individuals, precisely because he's arguing that proper life includes sexual desire and sexual difference. And for that very reason, no individual can be a full exemplification of the kind. And because of that, the only moment when the universal or the genus is realized is the moment of reproduction or the act of copulation. So that's the highest point of the life of the individual. And he goes on to say, after that, it may as well die. For the same reason, it may as well be food in sexual cannibalism. So it's just in there, my Stephen Jay Gould example is in fact an articulation of what Hegel thinks is the logic of all subrational life, or of all life, and of our life only not, because we're also thinking beings. Now, I think this creates a huge problem for ethical naturalists like Foot and Thompson, but MacIntyre is different in that he's trying to argue that we can derive from the very idea of being a dependent or finite rational animal to the special status that each individual needs to have. And as far as I can see, the argument, the argument goes roughly like this. By contrast to the subrational animals who are more or less defined by instinct, we have to learn to understand ourselves as practical reasoners. And in order to learn, we depend on others who initially teach us. But those teachers can be wrong too. So those teachers have to be checked as well. And so it's precisely the possibility of erring that follows from our finitude, that according to his argument requires the virtues and the need to recognize others as equal. So he says, our intellectual errors are often, although not always, rooted in our moral errors. From both types of mistake, the best protection are friendship and collegiality. And so a little later, in the book, he says, moral commitments to the virtues, namely truthfulness and justice, and recognizing others as equal, and to the common good, is not an external constraint, but a condition of inquiry and criticism. So the virtues are here derived from what is a condition of the possibility of cognitive endeavor about the good for a finite rational being. It's quite similar in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity. It's from the need for learning and the possibility of error that he argues for the need to deliberate together. And from the need to deliberate together about the question, what is good, we're supposed to derive the necessity to recognize each voice. So those who deliberate together need to ensure that no relevant voice is to be excluded or ignored. Each consideration is to be given due rational weight. And so then he equally derives the exclusion of force and threat, because this undermines the cognitive endeavor. And so it's these unconditional obedience, for instance, of murder and of oppression are needed for the possibility of rational deliberation, without which no one can inquire properly into the good. Now, I think that what's quite strange about this argument, that it looks like the need to recognize the equality of the other and the special status of the rational individual is derived from the conditions of the possibility of epistemological discourse. To my mind, this raises two problems. The first one is, how does this really rule out elitism? Aristotle surely recognizes this thing, but he thinks it's enough to have a couple of educated ones who can discuss together and argue with each other. It doesn't require that everyone partakes in discourse. However, it's precisely with respect to the good that MacIntyre wants to say that here everyone, there cannot be experts, everyone needs to partake in that discourse and determine it for themselves. But it doesn't really like, I might need some others to protect me from error, but I don't need everyone. It looks like, so the argument seems to fall a little short. I think it's supposed to be, the argument is developed in alienated social practices. One undermines the possibility of cognition, but I don't think this really solves the issue of elitism. The second one is, given the way he started in the book, the good for human beings is out there to be discovered. It doesn't follow from the fact that even if it's true, that the virtues and recognizing each other as equal is as necessary for success in epistemic discourse. It doesn't follow that the content of what I discover is the equality of everyone, or the idea that everyone needs to be free for anyone to be free. It could turn out, for all he said, that what I then discover after I had all those virtues in order to engage in the cognition is that what befits some human beings, including me, is to serve others. It's not excluded by the, it doesn't follow from the fact that certain virtues are needed for engaging in the cognitive process, that the content of such cognition about the good has a certain character. And so it looks like the argument fundamentally comes too late. It looks like it already needs to be presupposed that the individual has a certain status such that they need to engage in this cognitive process, whereas the argument of dependent rational animal proceeds the opposite way. It's from the protection against error in cognition that we're supposed to get the virtues rather than the other way around. Now I'm, okay, I've been speaking for a long time. Just quickly, 2 points. The way Hegel proceeds is that he's arguing that contradiction in life, where no individual is a full realization of the universal, is sublated by the idea of thought and cognition, which is the realization of the universal in the universal. And he, in fact, praises Aristotle for seeing this fundamental shift. For seeing this fundamental shift when Aristotle argues in the Anima that whereas the plants and the animals partake in the eternal and divine only through the cycle of self-maintenance and reproduction, it's the act of thinking that partakes directly in the eternal and divine. However, the problem with Aristotle, Hegel argues, is that he doesn't properly connect this insight about the character of thought with the character of a living being that has thought. So his point about the mistake that leads Aristotle to the natural slave is precisely the idea that freedom is conceived, he thinks generally in the ancient world, as a feature of nature, as a natural power. And because it is so conceived, it will be possible to think, just as with the powers of suprarational animals, that the distribution of that power is only some. It's only for, or like the distribution of the power of any suprarational animal can be such that only some of them, some of the features, some of the specimen of a kind fully realize it, and others are not there to realize it. And so he argues it's precisely that's the mistake of Aristotle, and he famously argues that the idea of the infinite value of the individual, which actually is the foundation of the whole idea of the unity of the good of the individual and the good of the community, enters with Christianity. I don't want to say anything about whether Hegel is right about that claim. Certainly Aristotle didn't have it. Now it enters in Aquinas precisely through an argument that it is because the law is given to each of us individually that the rational animal is governed for its own sake, he says, whereas the other species are just governed for the sake of their, right, whereas the other suprarational animals are just governed for the sake of their species. So just as Hegel Aquinas thinks, the suprarational animals are indeed just means for the survival of their species, and only the rational animal has this special character. But now in Aquinas' case, precisely because of the idea of the given law, this is in fact a form of possibilism. You know your own agency by knowing that law, and not essentially by acting. Whereas Hegel tries to develop the actualist version of that thought through the account of the historical development of the self-realization of freedom. Now, it's a very hard story to tell, but I think by shying away from it, we get the MacIntyre is moving either to something that loses the idea of knowledge or something that loses the actualism of after virtue. All right. Sorry for being so long. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So any questions? So Bob Stern.
Hi, thanks, guys. So I just wonder whether you think the logic of MacIntyre's position, independent rational animals, should be some form of care ethics. So I think you're right that he's got this sort of strange argument about, well, we're sort of dependent because we need other people somehow to work through what the good is, and it becomes highly intellectualized. But it seems to me the insight of dependent rational animals is we're vulnerable creatures in various ways, including intellectually, but not just intellectually. And an ethics flows from that. Is that a way of, I mean, why isn't that the right way to take what you might learn from dependent rational animals?
Well, I don't think I mean, there's two questions. I don't think the argument quite works that way. The argument.
No, I'm not saying that is his argument. I'm just saying that would be a better argument based on the insight of our dependence. I mean, we are vulnerable, dependent beings. That's what I think he learned actually from Lögstrup. From this day.
Right, this may be
but
true,
he made a complete hash of it, basically, by over-intellectualizing it and therefore ending up in a very strange place.
Right, no, it is I'm agreeing with you with that. He's in fact arguing from the vulnerability of cognition to the need for care for the disabled.
Yeah, so but we're not just vulnerable cognitively. Right, I mean, we're vulnerable all over the bloody place.
Right. But now but I think the reason for arguing so is, of course, all kinds of other animals are also very vulnerable.
Yep.
But now the same kind of organic wisdom that Stephen Jay Gould points out about these strange kind of sexual cannibalism in the fly is also that it's organically quite wise for the bear mother to eat the sick young. It's a weird anthropomorphic projection to say something goes wrong there. The bear mother eats the young when it is sick to insecure that no one else gets sick, or they eat some young when there's shortage of food. So the vulnerability doesn't derive a necessity for care. It's only because the individual has a certain status that the necessity of care can be derived from the vulnerability. But so I think it's that's why I think it's sort of the of course in Hegel's case it's goes all to bourgeois citizenship, and there are all kinds of problems there. But I think the idea that the individual needs to get a certain status that it doesn't quite have just qua being human in the ancient world is something that Marx also sees. I mean, the early Marx makes the same kind of points with species being about getting the special status of the special form of the relation between the individual and its kind when the life form is a thinking one. But this can't be just had from Aristotle. And I think that this is Hegel and Marx are very clear about this. I think
are you saying then that only rational creatures, not animals, only rational creatures, if we can protect them from pain and suffering, doesn't count?
I don't want to say, right, I mean,
I mean, you're not giving the human any special status in that respect. You're not saying only human suffering matters, presumably.
I'm not saying that, but I'm.
So why do you need this attempt to kind of carve out a special status for human suffering over that of other creatures?
I think it's different to say only human suffering counts at all, and to say that the thinking animal has, as Hegel puts it, infinite value, in a way that Hegel thinks, Hegel and Aquinas and the whole tradition thinks, the subrational creatures don't, which is why we can eat them. This is central to that whole tradition. Now, I don't want to say something about my own view. I just want to say, like, you can't get that out of Hegel. I mean, this is sort of not, everything collapses if you take that away.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm not defending the people you're trying to defend. I'm trying to give you a better understanding what really the idea of dependence rational animals means. It becomes a care ethics, which is exactly not this tradition that you're trying to defend. Anyway,
right,
it's been a long day.
Yes, okay. No, it's interesting. I don't think the care ethics can get us everything we want in ethics, because it doesn't. For instance, it doesn't exclude paternalism in the right way. Sorry?
Yes, it does. But that's it. Yes,
no,
it
right.
does.
Of course. I mean, this may be developed, but all I need to say as my response to you now is, unless you say much more, the idea of caring for the vulnerability of another is not the kind of thing one wants when one wants to get to the idea of partaking freely in a social whole as something that's required for everyone. And that's an idea that.
Why not? Anyway, it's been a long day. Other people have questions. I don't get it.
Robert Pippin?
Yeah, thanks very much, Matthias. Just on this last exchange, my impression of what you're raising is an objection in general, in very general terms, to a neo-Aristotelian or Thomistic Aristotelian naturalism. I mean, by raising it originally in the voice of Hegel, it strikes me as what you're saying is, once we introduce into ethical deliberations, essentially not Kant's theory, but Kant's principle about the absolute worth and dignity, absolute, immeasurable, impossible to exchange, the absolute worth of every single individual, we can't get out of what is essentially a generally prudential eudaimonistic ethics, an exclusion of a form of life in which some count less than others for the sake of the happiness of the whole. And that, by the way, that seems to be quite right. And that's what gets transmogrified into Hegel, into if nobody counts unless everybody counts, no one can be free unless everybody are free. That's the inheritance of that introduction. Now, you can get it in Thomas because everyone is created in the image of God. Every single person is created in the image of God. So MacIntyre, when he's starting to worry about the relativism involved in his narrative process kind of picture in After Virtue, has to try to move to something he thinks will give him a way of excluding from Aristotelian naturalism what you call paternalism or any kind of conception of inequality. There's nothing in Aristotle or in that position, even historicized, that would stop us from saying, well, in some conditions, the general happiness of everyone, including for the servants, would require an unequal relationship of rule, of some people telling other people what to do. That all seems to be quite right and very well done in your paper. But what I wanted to ask you to say something about was, when MacIntyre, faces this problem, and he wants to kind of exclude both elitism and a too loose and potentially relativistic conception of internally based practice. What does that do to the whole picture you started with? I mean, I take very seriously the idea in Hegel and in Aristotle that we only know the good by living the good, that we can do the truth, right? But then when this problem emerges of how, in Hegel, for example, we can say one tradition is better than another, we're not just radically pluralistic. Hegel has his own way of answering this with the logic and the divinity of thought and so forth and so on. MacIntyre creates this agent-observer distinction, and which of course naturally raises a question, which I hope you can say more about. How do you think he thinks, or how do you think we ought to think about the relationship between those two? I mean, if really knowing the good is in the process of living the good, and this goes back to what Bob was saying about Talbot Brewer and so forth, the coming to know by starting inchoately and then beginning to develop a sense of what makes human life flourish in a way in which the basic moral calculation is prudential in a much more non-instrumental sense, but a sense in which we're all aiming for a flourishing, happy life. What is the role of these considerations about the species form and the lower animals and this general reflection? What does that do to the view that knowing the good is only living the good? What happened to that in the shift to, well, here's the way the good we would come to know is out there to be known, and I'm just going to say we'll get there by the practice of living the good. I'm confident this is what we'll get. Right. How can he say that?
So I was thinking he's losing the actualism when he tries to solve the relativism.
Yes,
so, I mean, this
exactly
is
right.
That's supposed to be that was supposed to be the dialectic of my paper, is that
right, exactly.
The attractive thing about after virtue is the actualism, but the whole problem, and of course Aristotle is an actualist, and Hegel would say that's the great insight of Aristotle. The problem is that it's very easy to be an actualist when you're an elitist. Like when you're thinking, all right, the phronesis is just for the educated few, then there is no problem about being an actualist, because the good is not for many to know. For the many the good is not for the many to know, it's just for the elite few. Then there's no problem being an actualist. And which is why now there are different ways of trying to get the Christian idea of the good being for all that runs through the idea of becoming a possibilist. Now, in this strange way, MacIntyre is one, because if I can know the end of the human beings from the observer's standpoint, I don't yet need to do it. It requires a further step to then bring it to practice. I think this version has the additional problem. If I could know it by observation, just in the same way I know it about plants and animals, then it's hard to see how we can get the infinite value of the individual. That was my problem there. But then, of course, Kant is like a rigorous development of the good must be for everyone, which is precisely why it cannot be actual, which is why we can only infinitely strive towards the ideal. In fact, Aquinas, even though he's closer to Aristotle's actualism, has something like that too, because before we can do the word, we need to hear the word by the word being given in the form of a law. And this must be general knowledge, even though the perfect knowledge is, only those have who actually do it. But we actually already have knowledge of the good independently of whether we actually do it. And this runs deeply through the whole Thomistic system. And then, in fact, as Hegel will argue, leads to the split between, the infinite demands of charity with what we actually think is the just order of society, which doesn't look quite like charity wants it to be. Like that split is very alive in Aquinas. And the extreme operation of Hegel is the idea we have the Aristotelian actualism, but it must be such that the good is actual for everyone, for it to be known by anyone. That's the extreme tension of that's why it's so hard to derive all these steps, because he wants to bring the two together. So does that help?
Yeah, quite a bit. Thank you.
Jeff Nicholas.
Thanks, and thanks, Matthias, for this paper. It's got a lot of interesting and wonderful parts to it, and it helps clarify some of my own thoughts. I do have three disagreements, or want to ask three questions about the interpretation of MacIntyre, and then one about the interpretation of Thomas. First off, in terms of the what I call the omega point that MacIntyre and Taylor have in terms of their view of traditions coming together into this one tradition at the end, I think that that's too Hegelian in some sense, as I challenge in my own book, and it misses out some of what MacIntyre himself says about how traditions can prove their rationality, or how other traditions prove their irrationality. And what I think is missing there is the critical realism, right? So MacIntyre is clear that a tradition that cannot survive or is less successful in terms of helping its members live in the concrete world is going to be less rational, right? People are going to die out. So that's just a simple critical realism point there. In terms of the vulnerability and dependent rational animal, I think Bob is right there. I think people like Eva Feder-Kate would take this as a form of talking not just about intellectual vulnerability, but about physical bodily vulnerability, right? And that's why the virtues that we're talking about at the end, misericordia and wakantanaka, just generosity, are about the responsibilities of the community for the deplorable conditions that people might find themselves in materially, right? So if we see someone who's in need, right, this is a Marxist element that's coming out there, as well as a Lakota and a Thomistic one. If we see someone in need, we have a responsibility to give to them physically, not just intellectually. So I think the issue there about community, then I can't speak to Gould, but it seems to me that MacIntyre would be much more appreciative of someone like Kropotkin, who points out the way that the way that Darwin has been interpreted has been too individualistic, too competitive, and that there's lots of evidence in the natural world for cooperation. The third point is the main issue that you came to at the end in terms of the individual good and the common good. And the point there is that the individual good can only be identified in relationship to the common good, right? So it's not that there is two different theoretical points of where we identify what the individual good is that the common good is common not as a concretion or adding up of individual goods. He's very clear about that, right? It's that when we come to realize the common good, what we come to realize is that we can only achieve it together, and that means that each person has to have their voice. So it's the vulnerability that leads us to say we need to listen to each other ends up in saying, because our common good as rational species requires us to be able to listen to and learn from each other. And that leads me to this problem with Thomas Aquinas. It's not for Thomas Aquinas, as I understand it, that we know the good and therefore we can act on it, and so we lose the actuality. It's that we learn what the good is through the actuality, right? So each tradition can determine for itself what that good is in practice. So, for instance, when he talks about the division of property, he says each community determines what the division of property is, even though the natural law says that owning property is correct. So the theory and the actuality come together there, and I don't see that that's what you're saying in your argument. I know that's a lot there, but you had a very rich paper, and it's all on things that I do my own research on. So I really appreciate that and engagement. Thank you.
Thank you for these great questions. I'm not sure I can do justice to all of them. maybe from the back, of course, Aquinas also has the way Aquinas understands what Aristotle calls phronesis. It will also be an actualism. Sort of the phronimos the phronimos is the one who does in fact act well in a community who has determined the good in their practices. But it's quite crucial for Aquinas' whole system that there is another level of genuine knowledge of the good, having to do with the first precepts, synderesis and conscientia, that does not require that this is actual yet. And that distinction is new in Aquinas. Aristotle doesn't have it. Aristotle has only one knowledge of the good, that is practical wisdom, whereas Aquinas introduces that that division of first principles that are different from the perfect knowledge that one has in the developed communal life. So I was referring to that sort of, this is quite crucial for him to say that and it's right, by the same token, the full realization of what we already know as the good through the first precepts isn't in this life, and that's something that Hegel will deny. So I think that so I agree with you about the point you made. And I just meant another aspect of the thing. I think that's what I wanted to say to the third question. About the second question of the vulnerability, I think there's partly a misunderstanding. I noticed that I haven't properly responded to Bob's question, but but of course, MacIntyre and everyone who thinks sensibly of ethics will say that of course we are dependent not only intellectually but also physically on each other, and right, of course, and so of course that's why there is such a thing as the necessity to help others, and to look after the disabled. Like, of course, this is included in MacIntyre, and because we are vulnerable animals. It's just that in his argument, he in fact derives the necessity to look after the disabled from problems that arise about the cognitive determination of the good. So it's the stronger dimension of, I think that's how the argument works in that book. Whether I haven't said anything about another way to develop care ethics. I think for all of the, unless one wants to make that general argument that whenever there is pain, something needs to be done, then right now, of course, but this is not what you're saying. Then one needs to have an argument why certain of the vulnerable creatures that there are have a special status. And then Hegel has one story, Kant has another story. I know you disagree. I see you shaking your head. Right, but I then in order to have that discussion proper, I need to hear more on what you're thinking, and I would love to hear that on another occasion, maybe.
Just to say very briefly, vulnerability is not the same as pain. They're not the same thing. So
that's fine, but I don't think it makes a difference. The cockroach
makes a huge difference, because you then don't generate this sort of this myth of utilitarian maximization about pain.
But all kinds of creatures are vulnerable.
Yeah.
and I don't think, I mean, I don't think that MacIntyre thinks that we should protect all the vulnerable creatures there are. The cockroaches, I mean, this is not what is on his mind. What is on his mind is that certain forms of animal life involve them cooperating because of their vulnerability. But now the thing I noted there is that, for instance, bears are very cooperative animals, but it's that according to the standards of their life form, and anything else is insane anthropomorphic projection, it's totally fine for the bear mother to eat the young when it's sick. If you have a naturalistic account of, that's the teleology of their life.
Now, I didn't say this was naturalistic in that sense. And I also think it's really weird to think that we care about other people because they might help us find out about the good.
I'm not arguing for this.
No, but that's the position you're, as it were, defending on MacIntyre's behalf.
I see where you're coming from. Right. Now I still don't quite, I'm not quite sure what you have in mind, but
well, it's fine. It's fine. I shouldn't have introduced it.
No, I would love to talk to you more so that I get clear on what you have in mind. Sorry, what was your first question, Jeff? Now I'm lost. Sorry.
It was about the critical realism as part of the rationality of traditions. That a tradition has to help us survive if it's going to be rational.
Right. I was worried that that's true. A tradition has to help us survive.
Maybe I missed something in your talk. I thought that you were suggesting that there's no way for traditions to prove they're rational outside of these sort of disagreements that they have, or there has to be some overlap. But I think from MacIntyre's perspective, the critical realism, first off, critical realism means there has to be some kind of overlap because we all are of the same species. But regardless of that point, there is a way for them to not share it, not have any overlap, and still one prove more rational for the other. So my common example would be that the Lakota tradition, the Sioux, as people call them in the United States, is more rational than the Lockean property system, because the Lockean property system is leading to this climate collapse and the humans are going to die, whereas the Lakota one would not. But they don't share much, if anything at all, in terms of their principles of rationality.
Right. Yes. No. Right. I see. I mean, it's interesting that he doesn't quite put it that way when he engages with the charge of relativism in that postscript. I mean, all I need for my purposes was the thought there could be traditions with opposing principles that both sustain themselves and then he has nothing to say about going by his principles. He has nothing to say about which one is right. Now, interestingly, there is a question whether an unequal society can sustain itself by the principles of put forward in After Virtue. I don't think this can be excluded.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's a great paper and discussion. And so thanks everyone. Yeah, all the speakers and so I think did David? Did you have something to say, David?
Yes. Yeah. Me and David. We just I just want to I think Caleb did. Thanking all the speakers. So give a round of applause.
Well, we should especially thank Matthias.
and
Matthias
all those
and
grave personal vulnerability and sickness to be here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much for organizing this wonderful conference. I had a great time.
And Bob dealing with COVID, and Rahel dealing with her jaw, the accident, and hopefully everyone speedy recovery. Last thing I wanted to just mention before I pass it on to David is I think David conveyed this already. There's an edited volume that we began working on, and I think it was conveyed. So keep a lookout in email for that. And last thing was there was an idea of broaching of a follow-up conference involving Charles Taylor, Hegel, and Alistair MacIntyre. So hopefully people are interested in participating. Okay, I'll pass it on to David. Thank you very much.
I don't want to keep everyone much longer. Just to add another word of thanks also for our sponsors, Committee on Social Thought and the International Society for MacIntyre Inquiry. I'm posting the link to ISME's website in the chat here. They have wonderful annual conferences. Everyone should sign up to their newsletter, check them out, consider pitching a paper there. And also because people asked, we have recorded the talks, and with the permission of the speakers, we will make those talks available on the website, and I will send out an email to everyone who signed up for the conference when the talks are available there. So yeah, final round of applause and thanks to everyone, to our speakers, to the audience for coming out, and I hope we'll find ways to continue all these discussions. Thank you all so much.